Hello, and welcome to The Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, we're going to talk about something that does eat away at DS relationships quietly. Today, I'm going to talk to you all about resentment inside of relationships. First, I want to take a moment to thank you all who continue to tune in, reach out, share your stories with me, share your questions. The show is actually getting to the point where it's close to 5,000 listeners across all of the platforms that the Kink Perspective is on, which totally blows me away. So if you find value in these episodes, do me a favor. Make sure you like, subscribe, rate the show wherever you're listening. And if you do want to support the work directly, you'll find a donation link in the episode's or in the show's description. Every little bit truly helps, and I very much appreciate it. So let's go ahead and start talking about resentment here, right? Resentment doesn't usually announce itself. It's not always loud or dramatic, but most of the time, it slips in slowly. Less laughter, a little bit less warmth, more obligation. You're showing up, but it feels like something's gone missing. In DS dynamics, it's easy to miss those early signs. Roles can become routines. A ritual can start to replace connection. You go through the motions because that's what's expected, but underneath, something doesn't really feel right. Now, maybe you're the dominant and you've noticed you're not as responsive, you're not as open. Maybe you're the sub here, that what used to feel grounded to you now feels more like a chore. The problem is, it isn't always the fight you had last week. It's the 10 things you didn't say before that. It's the story you tell yourself to avoid naming what's wrong, because when your dynamic becomes more about performance than participation, something's off. And if you don't name it, resentment will. So let's first start here and slow this down and talk about what resentment actually is, because too many people misread it, they downplay it, or they even mistake it for something else. Now, resentment is not just about being angry at your partner. It's not just about a grudge. It's what happens when needs go unmet for too long and you start to feel like there's no safe or effective way to express that need anymore. It's a psychological holding pattern, if you will. You start to feel stuck. You feel powerless to change what's wrong, but too invested or afraid to walk away. And so you stay. You adapt. You suppress, and the longer you do, the heavier the toll gets. And bear in mind, when people come and I'm working with them one-on-one or I'm working with couples, this is a pattern I start to see inside of these relationships, or people are talking to me about their relationships, and I see this. And this, a very simple question comes out. What stopped you from talking about it, right? Because here's the deal. Resentment builds in silence, but it feeds off the helplessness. That's what makes it so dangerous in long-term dynamics, especially in ones that evolve in power exchange. When you're in a DS dynamic, the waters can get murky real quick, right? It's easy to confuse obedience with agreement or leadership with attentiveness. You can go a week, maybe months, even thinking everything's running smoothly because no one's talking about anything. But no one speaking up doesn't mean everything's okay. It just means someone's stopped feeling heard. So let's talk about how that happens. It usually begins with something small, right? There's a moment where your partner maybe disappoints you. They forgot a protocol. They missed something that mattered to you. Maybe they dismiss a concern you tried to raise, right? Maybe it's the dominant who starts to pull away emotionally, or assuming that everything's okay because they're still fulfilling their role technically. Maybe it's the sub here who begins to feel their needs outside of the scenes aren't very welcome, and that they're too much, so they stop bringing them up. Now, the first few times you justify it, you tell yourself, hey, they try, they're tired. They didn't mean it like that. Maybe it's just me, right? We start internalizing some of these things, but it keeps happening, and each time you stay quiet, it chips away at your trust. Not just them, but the relationship itself. And that's the thing about resentment. It accumulates. It doesn't explode right away. It piles up slowly in the background, right? While life keeps moving forward. You keep showing up. You keep doing the rituals. You keep saying, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. And on the surface, everything looks functional. But underneath, the emotional weight is starting to build. Now, in a healthy relationship, the structure should make communication easier, not harder. But too often, people weaponize roles to avoid real conversations. Dominants who lean too hard on control try to maybe hide from emotional accountability. Subs who confuse silence with loyalty, thinking they're being good by enduring discomfort. Now, let me be clear here, enduring is not the same as consenting. And leadership isn't control, it's care with direction. If either side forgets that, resentment will start creeping in. Now, I want to give you a few examples so you start to understand this. Now, a dominant insists on maybe a daily ritual, but stops checking in emotionally. So the sub here might start feeling used, like a function, not a person, but doesn't say anything because they don't want to seem ungrateful. They start fantasizing about being elsewhere, or worse, they start to go numb. Well, that's resentment. Or maybe a submissive agrees to a protocol they're not fully comfortable with, hoping they'll adjust or that the discomfort will go away. It doesn't. They start pulling back, maybe subtly. They start resisting the tasks, forgetting, quote unquote, the rituals, right? The dominant gets frustrated, but no one's naming the real problem. The agreement wasn't real. That's resentment. Now, maybe a dynamic falls into a routine. Everything looks fine, but both of you are feeling disconnected. Both parties are afraid to name it because they don't want to break the dynamic. If you name the truth, though, right? If you're naming it and that breaks the dynamic, it was already breaking. So you're just finally admitting it. And then there's the emotional labor imbalance. This is really the big one. One person ends up doing all the relational maintenance. They check in, they're sensing mood shifts, initiating talks, maybe managing conflicts. The other person just receives, often unintentionally. They're not trying to be passive, but they've come to expect the other person to carry that weight over and carry all things about the dynamic for one person, right? Now, over time, the dynamic starts to get a little bit brittle. It frays on the edges because love, care, and connection need two people actively participating, even if they're doing so in different ways. So let's name it clearly here. If one of you is doing 80% of the emotional lifting, this is no longer a shared dynamic. It's emotional outsourcing, if you will. And that will not sustain itself long term. Even if the partner doing all the work what's going to end up happening is they're either going to burn out or they're going to shut down. And they may not tell you that it's happening until they're already halfway out the door. Now, I want to acknowledge that not all resentment is about someone doing something wrong. Sometimes it's about unspoken expectations or values that never really align to begin with. Sometimes it's about outside pressure, that financial strain, time management, illness, family stress that neither of you handled well, and it seeped into the relationship. The source doesn't have to be malicious, but ignoring it will always lead to damage. So, what do you do here? Well, the first step you got to do is you have to notice that it's starting to happen. Looking honestly at where you feel tight and heavy or disconnected, right? These are the areas that get more and more difficult over time to start discussing. Naming what's quietly been bothering you, not with, you're not blaming them, but with clarity. Because resentment is what fills the space where truth should be. You don't need a full rupture to justify speaking up. You don't need to wait for a crisis to ask for change. If you're feeling something shift, if connection feels dimmer, if you're second guessing yourself more than usual, it's worth paying attention to. And a lot of the times we tend to ignore it, right? And in power exchange, it's not just about paying attention. It's about choosing to protect not just the structure of your dynamic, but the emotional integrity of it. Because if you're only protecting roles, it's not just the relationship, but resentment eventually will take over. So how does all of this resentment feed on silence? Well, we need to talk about the silence because, that's really quite powerful. And silence is not the peaceful kind. It's not the comfortable kind between two people who understand each other. I'm talking about the silence that shows up when you've got something to say, but you don't feel like you can. Or maybe you're tired of trying, right? Maybe it feels safer to hold your tongue than to risk a reaction you can't predict. And so slowly you start saying less, not just with words, but with your energy, with your body, with your presence. And here's the reality of this. Resentment thrives in that kind of silence. The longer your needs go unmet, the harder it becomes to bring them up. At first, it's maybe, I don't know, a delay, right? I'll wait for the right time. Then it becomes a pattern. It's probably not a big deal. And eventually, it becomes avoidance. You don't bring it up because you don't believe it will matter. You don't believe anything's going to change. And that right there, that's when resentment starts to settle in. It doesn't show all up at once either. It builds quietly. It pauses in the moments you choose not to say anything because you don't want to, quote unquote, rock the boat. But the irony is when we're afraid to rock the boat, we let the whole damn thing sink. And I see this all the time in DS dynamics. I see it play out on social media. I see it play out when I'm working with people. I see it play out when people contact me or are responding or anywhere else. And especially in long-term relationships. There's kind of a performance pressure that can creeps in, if you will. You've built a structure together. You spent time negotiating roles, rituals, language, expectations. And somewhere inside of there, the emotional undercurrent starts to shift. But no one's saying anything because to do so feels like a line, breaking character, if you will. Dominants stay silent because they're afraid to look weak or maybe unsure or inconsistent. A sub might stay silent because they don't want to seem needy or difficult or like they're not strong enough for the structure they've agreed to. So both of you start pretending that things are fine. That rituals still mean what they used to. that connection is still clean, but you can feel it, can't you? You can feel when the weight shifts. You can feel when someone's showing up out of obligation instead of desire. You can feel when presence becomes performance. And again, I see this time and time again, but we get scared to talk about it because I'm waiting for the right time, or we're going to go away for the weekend, so I'll bring it up then, or, oh, it wasn't a good time because this has happened. We just keep making excuses. And a week becomes a month becomes a half a year becomes a year. Next thing, we're no longer happy. And that's the silence I'm talking about. And it gets worse the longer it goes unaddressed. Irritation becomes bitterness. Bitterness becomes distance. Distance becomes apathy. And apathy is one of the hardest to come back from. Because when someone no longer cares enough to even feel angry, when they've numbed themselves to avoid another disappointment, when you stop fighting because there's nothing left to protect, that's when the foundation starts to crack for real. So let me ask you directly, when did you last express a real need in your dynamic? Not a suggestion, not a hint, not passive aggression or coded language, a real, honest need. And when your partner last brought something to you, did you listen without defending yourself? Did you hear them? Or did you brace yourself for what felt like criticism? Because here's the thing, most resentment isn't about what happened, it's about what kept happening over and over without acknowledgement, without repair, without language. That's the tragedy of silence. It makes invisible what should have been brought into the open. It teaches us to adapt to discomfort instead of addressing it. And in a lifestyle where communication is supposed to be one of our big cornerstones here, silence is a kind of betrayal. Not because people are malicious, but because they're afraid of losing the dynamic, afraid of being too much, afraid of change. But silence, don't get me wrong, it is a decision. Choosing not to speak is a choice, and it's always has a cost. You might think you're keeping the peace, but really you're just delaying the rupture. Because what doesn't get addressed now gets expressed in other ways. Distance, detachment, resentment, until one day someone says, I can't do this anymore, and the other person is just blindsided. So if you're listening right now, if you're hearing what I'm telling you, if you feel that tightness in your chest or that sinking feeling in your stomach when I describe some of this, pause for a second. Sit with it. Ask yourself, what have I been holding back? Where have I been quiet, right, to keep things stable? But in doing so, I've made myself small. And what would it look like to speak up, not as an attack, but as a way of fighting for the connection? Because if silence is the soil where resentment grows, then honesty, gentle, grounded, honest expression is how we start to clear it out. You don't need to yell, you don't need to explode, but you do need to say the thing, right? The health of your dynamic doesn't depend on everything always being perfect. It depends on whether you can name what's imperfect without losing each other in the process. And we need to talk about here, especially now, how forgiveness gets misused, because I think that's a big part. So let's get into something that I see misunderstood in both vanilla and kink dynamics: forgiveness. It's a word that gets used a lot, especially after conflict or hurt or even disappointment. And most of the time, people think of forgiveness as the high road. Be the bigger person, let it go, don't hold on to the past. But here's what I want you to really hear today. Forgiveness isn't about being the bigger person. It's not about stuffing your anger, swallowing your hurt, or pretending everything's okay because you're tired of talking about it. Forgiveness is not silence. And in the lifestyle, I see this play out in some specific damaging ways. Someone crosses a line, maybe it's a missed boundary, poor communication, emotional neglect, right? Take your pick. And instead of holding that line, the hurt partner says, "It's fine, I forgive you." But what they really mean is, "I don't know how to talk about this without risking the dynamic, or worse, I don't think you'll take me seriously if I speak up." That's not forgiveness, that's fear dressed up as grace. And if you've ever been in that place where you said you forgave someone, but it still hurt, it still lived in your body. It still affected how safe you felt. You know exactly what I'm talking about here. Too many people confuse forgiveness with tolerance. They think forgiving someone means absorbing the pain and never bringing it up again. But forgiveness doesn't mean we pretend it didn't happen. It doesn't mean you owe them your silence so you can feel comfortable. And it doesn't mean you let them bypass the work of change. You don't forgive someone into changing. They change. They demonstrate accountability. They show you. They don't tell you. They understand what happened. They're actively working not to repeat it. And then forgiveness becomes possible, because real forgiveness needs structure. It needs context. It needs acknowledgement. It needs boundaries. If someone steps on your foot and doesn't apologize and you say, "It's okay, I forgive you," but they keep stepping on your foot, what exactly are you forgiving? The pattern, the disregard, the idea that your pain should be minimized because you don't want to seem dramatic? Forgiveness, when misused, becomes a form of self-erasure. And when that happens in power exchange dynamics, it's even harder to come back from, because the structure starts to feel unsafe. You start to question whether your consent actually matters, whether your limits are flexible depending on someone else's mood, whether you're being good or just being quiet. And that confusion, that's what erodes trust, not just in your partner, but in yourself. And once you start to erode trust in yourself inside of a dynamic, you're not coming back from that, right? Now, I want to be really clear. I'm not saying forgiveness isn't powerful. I deal in forgiveness and reclamation often in my practice. It is. But it has to come after accountability, not instead of it. You can't use forgiveness as a shortcut to avoid discomfort. You can't hand it out like a favor, hoping that it's going to motivate someone into change. That's not forgiveness. That's bargaining. Real forgiveness is a boundary, not a reset button. It sounds like this: I'm choosing to forgive you because I see you've done the work and you understand, and you're trying to actively repair the harm caused. Or, I'm releasing the emotional charge of this, but I'm not erasing what happened. Or maybe even, I'll move forward with you, but only if the behavior doesn't repeat. Forgiveness without those boundaries isn't grace, it's codependency. Because, you know what? Here's the deal. If you forgive too early, too often, or without real repair, you train the other person to believe that your pain doesn't have consequences, that your emotional safety is optional, that your hurt is temporary and manageable, as long as you don't make a scene. That's not a dynamic, people. That's emotional exploitation. So if you've been sitting in a place where you've said you've forgotten someone or you've forgiven someone, but you still feel unsettled, still maybe feel tense, you don't fully trust them, listen to that. It may not be that you failed to let it go, it may be they failed to own their part. Forgiveness should bring relief, not pressure, not obligation, not more silence. Sometimes the most honest form of forgiveness is distance, saying, you know what, I release the anger, but I can't continue to stay close to someone who doesn't value my well-being. So if you're holding on to something right now, maybe an old hurt, a repeated behavior, a dynamic that still brings, or it still stings but feels very heavy to name, ask yourself, have they owned their part? Have you expressed your full truth? And are you forgiving or are you tolerating? Because real forgiveness is about not keeping the peace. It's about protecting your peace. And I think we do this a lot when we look at these things because it's not the conflict. That's not the problem, because what we're really doing here is avoiding it. And that's something that makes or breaks most DS dynamics. Conflict. Guess what? We're going to talk about that now. Now, we often treat conflict like it's a red flag. Oh God, we're arguing, we're having a disagreement. Well, having disagreements doesn't somehow mean that the relationship is unstable. But that's not true. Conflict is not a threat. It's information. It tells you where the pain points are, where communication is breaking down, where expectations aren't lining up with reality. The real problem isn't the conflict. It's the avoidance of it. In fact, I'd argue that a dynamic without conflict is usually one where at least one person has stopped being honest. Psychologically, it makes sense. We just start to withdraw. We don't want to argue. And now I'm hiding or being deceptive about my feelings. You know what? Research, casework, clinical work, and millions of hours that people do around the world all name this pattern. It's something we see. So this gets us really complicated, especially complicated in DS, because the structure can make it look like things are working even when they're not. You've got protocol, you got a ritual, you have clear roles, but maybe even high consistency in the scene play. That's fine. From an outsider, from the outside or even to each other, it might seem like the dynamic is fine. Here's the reality. Structure in a relationship can mask avoidance. Just because no one's raising concerns doesn't mean there aren't any. And sometimes that silence isn't peace, it's pressure. In many relationships, I've seen dominants who resist feedback because it feels like a challenge to their authority. I've seen subs who hold in their frustrations because they think that bringing them up would make them difficult or unworthy of their role. But both people are trying to preserve the dynamic, but what they're really doing is protecting the illusion of stability at the cost of an actual connection. And this is where things start to fracture beneath the surface. A healthy dynamic has to be able to hold conflict, not avoid it. That means making room for tough conversations, even if that requires stepping out of your roles for a bit. Now, I know that can be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Stepping out of the dynamic, even temporarily, can feel like a loss of control or maybe identity. But here's what I want you to sit with. Suspending the role, to talk like equals isn't disrespecting the dynamic. It protects it. It's saying the relationship matters enough that I'm willing to be real with you, that I'm willing to take off the collar or the title or the ritual for 10 minutes so we both can be human in this room together. And then we decide how to rebuild. Because if you can't step out of the structure when things get hard, you're not in a dynamic, you're in a cage. And that goes both ways. Leadership on the other side of the slash isn't about who gets to have the last word. It's about who takes responsibility for the emotional health of the relationship. A dominant who shuts down hard conversations, you're not leading. Sorry. Don't care who you are. If you're shutting them down, you need to reevaluate yourself. And a sub who's bearing their needs to maintain obedience, you're not submitting. You're disappearing. Real leadership in DS means being able to say, I might not like hearing this, but I'm here and I'm listening, so let's figure it out. Because when conflict is handled well, it actually brings people closer. It builds trust. It deepens intimacy. It lets your partner know, I can bring you my mess and you're not going to abandon me. So here's what I want you to ask yourself. Can you name your partner's current emotional needs? Not just their preferred tasks or their rituals, but their emotional reality. Do you know what they're carrying right now? Second, can they name yours? Do you feel seen, not just as a role, but as a person? And if the answer is no, what's in the way? Fear of being too much, fear of conflict, worry that your vulnerability will disrupt the dynamic? Because if you're operating from a place where honesty feels like a risk, and that's not stability, it's just collapse. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, but what if you start picking apart everything? Won't it just make things worse? Well, I get the fear. It's real, but let me flip it. If your dynamic can't handle discomfort, it's not built for longevity. You don't need a perfect relationship to last. You need one where both people feel safe enough to be imperfect, to have bad days, to misstep, to speak up, and to work through it without fear of punishment, withdrawal, or dismissal. And that goes for everybody. Conflict handled well is a show of strength, not weakness. It's a sign that you value the relationship enough to risk discomfort, that you'd rather face something hard than pretend everything is fine while the foundation quietly erodes. So let this be a checkpoint for you, not a warning. It's not a guilt trip, just a moment to ask yourself, are we telling each other the truth? Are we willing to sit in some tension for the sake of real clarity? And if not, what will we need to feel safe enough to start? Because in a real lasting relationship, vanilla or lifestyle, the power exchange isn't the end goal, connection is. And connection without honesty is just performance. Now, here's where I want to leave you all with today. Resentment doesn't usually show up swinging. It creeps in quietly, and if you catch it early, you have options. You can talk, you can adjust, you can realign. But if you wait too long, until you're carrying contempt, until your trust is gone, it's a lot harder to come back from. If you're choosing to stay, it has to be a conscious choice. Not to the structure, not to the title, but to the relationship itself, to the connection you're building, not just the roles you're performing. Sometimes that means trading comfort for clarity. Sometimes it means having one small conversation that resets the course entirely. And sometimes it just means asking a simple question. Is this still working the way we both hoped it would? Because grace is earned, not owed. And growth that's built without honesty, that's just another form of denial with better manners. You deserve more than that. Your partner does too. No dynamic is worth staying in if it's built on unspoken grief, if the cost of keeping it alive is shrinking your truth. That's not power exchange. That's emotional resignation. And love? Love isn't proven by how much you endure. It's shown up by how honestly you speak when something stops working. That's the real measure of strength, not how long you can hold it together, but how brave you're willing to be when it starts to come apart. So here's my question for all of you. What conversation have you been avoiding in your dynamic because you're afraid it might change everything? And I think that's something you all can sit with. Maybe there is some conversations. Maybe you're in a new dynamic, but you're seeing some old patterns of something prior, but you don't want to say anything because it's new. You need to talk about it. Look, if you found this episode helpful today or made you reflect, let me know. Share it, put it in the comments section, reach out to me, send me an email. Doing this helps me reach more people who need to hear these things. I want to add a couple of things on a side note. I've got more shows coming up. Yes, I've got some more interviews. I'm still trying to get to Red Warrior. It's me, not her, but I'm going to. I promise that conversation is coming. I also want to address something else. There are people out there there is at least one or two podcasts I know out there trying to copy some of the things that I do. They'll claim that they discuss psychology and BDSM. I want to be very clear. As far as I know, there is no other show like mine. There is no other show that's as rated as high as mine that discusses and does what I do. Now, they say that imitation is a form of flattery, but I highly recommend find your own voice. It took me a while. My first few episodes when I started doing this show 4 years ago, it took me a bit. I was more robotic then. So I'm like my book, right? It was a little bit repetitive. So was I. It's taken me a while to come into my own voice. Find your voice. Second, I got this question and I just want to address it to you all. No, if you respond to some sort of Google poll where people are conducting, and I very loosely say conducting research, because what they're actually doing is trying to take information from you and then sell it back to you. They're not protecting your information because they may not be recording it, but Google is. The same for other people posting. There's another place that I've seen people can post polls or questions. Just be careful what you're being asked, right? And finally, I would never, ask you all to, I don't know, give me money for no apparent reason so I can just show up somewhere. If I show up, it's out of sincerity. And if I show up, to be quite honest with you, I'm showing up on my dime. I don't leverage my position for that. As you've all seen, the show is still free. I don't need, I am in the talks with somebody looking to sponsor my show, but that's because my, listener base is going up. That's just typical, but I'm very selective even who I want to have on here. Why am I telling you all this? Because I hear and I see a lot of things. I think a lot of people don't believe that, but I actually do read and I'm out there watching. So I see it, right? But anyways, I've digressed a little bit long enough. I do want to mention my book. It is out there. I appreciate all the support. People are starting to purchase it again. Don't complain to me if it's a little bit repetitive. You have been warned. It is psychologically repetitive. I think I have about 90 psychological references in that book. Yes, I know. It's my first book. What can I tell you? But if you do want it, Tangled Desires, the intersection between BDSM and psychology, wherever you get your ebooks or print copies from, you're more than welcome. I don't know how expensive. It's like $5 or $10 at this point. I don't really remember what I charge for it anymore. Anyway, let me know what you thought about the show today. Keep your questions coming. I do want to address, I am not going to be discussing, I've had a long think. Somebody asked me a very poignant question. Can BDSM heal my trauma? No, I'm not going to explore that. I've decided I'm not going to do that show. I'm very sorry, because I don't believe it can, and especially in its current form, especially the lack of effort and care that are inside of the lifestyle from when I've started. It's not about gatekeeping. It's also because there's no research to prove otherwise. Anecdotal research is not clinical research. So unfortunately, no, that's not a show I can do. I can talk about how to relieve some things and it can be therapeutic, but it will not be a cure to trauma, unfortunately. So I'm not going to do that show. I have some other things coming up. I've got to do dollification and still want to contact the gentleman out of the Middle East, I believe he's out of the UAE, but either way, that's coming too. All right, guys. Well, let me know what you thought about the show today. Keep the questions, comments. I love them all. If you can, and you follow me on Spotify, you got to get the app. Rate me there. Let's keep the show driving. I would love to drive it to, 5.0, and we'll go from there. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.